everybody. My name is Barbara Kolm. I'm the director of the Austrian Economics Center and the founder of the Free Market Roadshow, which we started more than a decade ago in just 4 European capitals. And now we are spreading it, or we have spread it all across the continent, doing more than 40 cities in 40 countries, and having expanded the entire project to more than 120 partners, international think tanks, universities, groups of entrepreneurs, business people, federations of industry and entrepreneurships, and of course discussing ways out of the gridlock. This year is our main topic, and it's my pleasure to thank our partners in Thessaloniki to host the second edition of this year's tour with very prominent speakers. And I briefly just mention their names because they will of course be introduced later by our moderator, Georgios Mantzouranedes, who is at ACT Lifelong Learning Center and who will then introduce our speakers. But first of all, our keynote speaker is Calum Nicholson from the Economic Standard, and he will present the keynote, and then later we have a panel discussion on where are we raising a generation without perspectives. And there our participants will be John Charalambakis from Blacksummit Financial Group, Mary Lucia Darst, she's an author and a musician, and Calum will be again joining us for this session. You all met John, born in Greece and living in the US, very well known to everybody. And very outspoken. He first spoke in Thessaloniki at our Free Market Roadshow right after the financial crisis hit Europe and especially Greece. He was speaking on the European Stability Mechanism and the bailout programs. And so you might recall that he is very outspoken. Mary, who will also be introduced later by Georgios, is a very good friend of the Institute and a very capable young author and musician who has been working in the fields of free market for a very long time and has published a lot on especially this topic that we are discussing later. And then Calum, who is with the Economic Standard, he's a journalist and also teaching and researching at the university. And he will also focus on the civil rights, democracy, education, politics, and regulation issues that we will discuss today. Furthermore, let me remind you that everything is recorded, that this event is live streamed at Facebook, at our website. It is a Zoom event today, and then we will include it in our international Free Market Roadshow website, and allow everybody to constantly have looks and discussions and debates. I also invite you to send notes and infos and questions to our participants to make the event more lively. And furthermore, finally, without the close cooperation of all our partners and the constant division of labor that we as pro-market people preach, but also put in practice, this entire roadshow would not be possible. We have multiple partners and donors across the world who you all see on the website, and without their support and help, we could not have run this event. Just life today, it's tremendously hot here in Vienna. For Vienna, it's 39 degrees Celsius, which is very warm. And there might be some IT issues. If so, please excuse us. We try to solve those problems, but you know, we also believe in spontaneous order, so we have to be flexible. And therefore, I just simply hand over to Georgios, and thanks a lot. Looking forward to an inspiring discussion.
Greetings, good day, and welcome to another Free Market Roadshow event. My name is Georgios, or George Mantzouranedes. I will be the moderator of this virtual event. And for that, we'll start by thanking, of course, the Free Market Roadshow people for giving me that opportunity. Currently, I am, as most Greeks and Europeans are, trying to deal with both the pandemic and the heat wave that's been troubling us over the past week. So I hope that this finds you in good health and with your AC unit on. I'm pretty sure that this is not your first online event or talk during these 15, 16 months of the pandemic, as I'm pretty sure that many, if not the majority of these meetings, were just procedural, or to put it nicely, without any interest at all. Well, this event will be an exception to that rule, not just because of the topic or the things our guests will share with us, which are definitely intriguing. As mundane as it might seem, I believe that online communication allows us to focus without any physical distractions on both the person on the other side of the connection and the things he or she says. A well-constructed and constructive dialogue is a matter of will, not of a medium. And it's one of the elements we need to create and maintain a perspective on things. Speaking of perspective, it is the topic of our keynote speaker's presentation. He will talk to us about the past, the present, the future, politics, the pandemic, the pandemic before that, our social media presence, and so much more. He's a writer, an academic, and without further ado, Dr. Nicholson will be our keynote presenter on the subject of perspective. Dr. Nicholson, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I've been asked today to discuss whether we're raising a generation that lacks perspective. And I don't think this question has come out of the blue. There's an obvious context that has, I guess, given rise to it. And this is that we're living in an increasingly polarized and ideologically rigid society. That is one in which most people seem to think that they are themselves right, be it factually or morally, and that by contrast, anyone who disagrees with them is both wrong and often immoral in their view. Notably, this is happening across the political spectrum. It isn't just a characteristic of the neo-Puritan left or the neo-nationalist right, the Remainers or the Leavers, the lockdown advocates or the skeptics, the climate believers or the deniers. It is a feature, I think, of all sides, whatever the debate in question may be. And it seems to me that in all this polarization, that what has been lost is a sense that there might be a middle ground, a space for compromise, and a recognition of the fact that reality is messy and that none of us are omniscient. 100 years ago, writing in the wake of a different pandemic, the poet Yeats famously wrote in his poem, The Second Coming, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." He added in lines that are equally applicable to what we see around us today, that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And it's certainly the case today that it is fashionable to be convicted, and passionately so, and that this is loosing a certain anarchy upon, at the very least, Western culture. And so I would argue that the key characteristic of all this polarity and of the increasing ideological fervor and the widespread fashion of feeling so strongly about something that one doesn't just believe it, but identifies with it or indeed as it, the key characteristic of all of this is the lacking of perspective. Fundamentally, a lot of people seem so wedded to particular viewpoints that they have lost perspective on the stubborn reality that there is almost always more than one way to look at any given problem. So what do we mean by lacking perspective? I think there are really two ways to understand this. The first is to be ignorant of, or to simply ignore, the tempering effect of putting things in context. We can explore this quickly by looking at a few key areas: climate change and lockdowns, and some current ideas in social justice, and support for characters like Donald Trump. So beginning with climate change. Climate change is probably the first popular, sustained, society-wide preoccupation that is fundamentally scientific in nature. There is, of course, nothing wrong with science to the extent we can generalize about it. Science is arguably the greatest achievement of Western culture. However, there is an assumption built into the discussions of climate change that the science can offer guidance to what actions can and must be taken, either to mitigate climate change or to adapt to it. And this is an assumption that can be challenged. Even if we agree that climate change is happening and agree that we are responsible, we're still no closer to understanding what we should do with and how we should respond to the scientific data on climate change. First, just because we understand climate change does not mean we understand its societal consequences. And second, even if we did understand its societal consequences, it still does not make it clear what we should do and how we should intervene. Again, context matters. This has long been argued by disaster risk reduction scholars who have shown that natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, always have a societal context. In a classic statement of their position, there is no such thing as a truly natural disaster. Rather, there are natural hazards, but the extent to which the results in disaster, to the extent to which this results in disaster is dependent on a range of social, political, and economic factors. As a consequence, we can say that earthquakes don't kill people. What kills people are collapsing buildings, and how many buildings collapse varies depending on the social, political, and economic context. As for lockdowns, it's a similar situation. Throughout the pandemic, we have repeatedly heard that government policy should be science-led. Yet while the nature of coronavirus is a scientific question, the issue of whether lockdowns are proportionate is a political one, referring not only to facts, but also to values. With lockdowns, social context matters as much as scientific content. The issue is not just how many people become infected or what the death rate is, but also what constitutes an acceptable level of risk. Where we draw that line and how indeed we define risk is a matter of culture and value, not scientific fact. Indeed, the lockdown skeptics themselves seem often to fall into an equal if opposite fundamentalism, failing to recognize that one may accept the reality of the coronavirus, but simply not believe that tells us much or indeed anything about what an appropriate societal response should be. In this sense, both sides of the debate lack perspective and fail to appreciate that society is not simply a matter of reacting to objective facts, but negotiating our subjective values. Similarly, with social justice issues, one can absolutely agree that racism, sexism, and various other forms of injustice exist. But this is not the same thing as knowing how to tackle them. I doubt there are many reasonable people who disagree that racism and sexism are terrible things. And the majority of people, I think, will agree that progress is needed on these issues. However, there is still room, and I would say a need, for debating how these issues are best tackled. The backlash to so-called woke identity politics is often dismissed as reactionary, people who are trying to maintain some oppressive status quo, be it white supremacist or patriarchal. It seems likely that, for the majority of people who are wary of identity politics, though, that this is not derived from extremist views, but simply because they have some reservations about the means by which certain groups of activists seek to make progress on these issues. It is surely quite reasonable to be wary of the growing trends to take language literally, to ignore intent and focus on how language makes people feel, to presume that words are violence akin to physical violence, and to seek to have someone cancelled and fired from their job for upholding long-standing liberal values, be it that we should judge people on their character, not their skin color or gender or anything else like that, or that freedom of speech means nothing if it is not for freedom for those with which we disagree or with whom we would disagree. Many social justice activists seem to lack the perspective to recognize that one can disagree with the movement, not because one rejects the content of its underlying principles, but rather because of its practices in the context of the real world. And finally, there is the example of the Trump phenomenon. Taking Trump, he is, or perhaps was, a political phenomenon who was viewed myopically not only by his opponents, but also by his proponents. I think his opponents saw him as a problem to be solved, and his proponents saw him as a solution to a problem. But it seems more plausible, I think, to see him as neither the problem nor the solution, but rather simply a sign that there is a problem in need of a solution. He was less the pathology to be cured or a cure to a pathology, in as much as he was a symptom of a pathology in need of a cure. Those who despise Trump seem to spend 4 years criticizing him without really asking, let alone answering, the question of what made his election possible. To suggest it was just because people were racist or sexist or any such thing strikes me as hubristically seeking to pass judgment on what he and his supporters are, rather than humbly trying to attain an understanding of why he was so appealing to them. There was a lack of perspective on the bigger picture, with everyone myopically focused on the effect, not the cause, the symptom, not the pathology. There was such a focus on the content of his character that the political economic context in which that character was appealing was hardly addressed at all. As for those who supported him, they seemed to equally lack perspective, for they completely ignored his character and the fact that someone so self-involved would hardly give a damn about their plight. So those are a few examples, I think, of how we can lack perspective in the first sense of being so fervently focused on the content of something we believe that we lack perspective on the broader context. But there is also a second sense in which we might mean losing perspective, which is closely related to the first. If the first was to presume that context doesn't matter, the second is to not recognize that when we think, we never do so from some dispassionate and objective vantage point, but always from within a particular context. This is another flaw characteristic of contemporary debate, the fundamental lack of reflexive self-awareness, of self-knowledge, and the humility that comes with that. We often hear today about people speaking their truth, but oddly, this does not mean people speak with doubt or humility, but rather with certainty and a degree of hubris. We seem as a society to have forgotten that hoary philosophical dictum pronounced by innumerable sages down the millennia, that a wise person knows only how little they know. The reality is that none of us have the perspective to presume we have some privileged access to the truth, be it about the world or even ourselves. We and the world are simply too complex for that. In looking at the world, how to separate our analyses from our values. In the social sciences, data may be objective, but the definitions of what that data is of and the reasons why we are interested in that data are subjective. In looking at ourselves, how to separate what we see from what we want to see, how to unravel our thoughts from our feelings. When we pull back, it is obvious that every culture, like every religion, feels they have the truth and others are wrong and deluded, that most generations look to their forefathers and think the same, and that most individuals think that they have a better perspective on things than other people. It rarely occurs to us to consider that we may well, at the cultural, generational, and indeed individual level, be just as likely to miss out context as everyone else. As a system of thought and value, if there was one advantage of liberal and enlightened values, it was that our capacity for self-delusion was presumed. This is why people are innocent until proven guilty. It is why the standard of science is not whether it can be found to be true, but proven to be false. It is why freedom of speech means nothing if not the freedom for those we disagree with. And yet, in contemporary debate, this awareness of our limits and the humility it brings are all missing. In cancel culture, we see people presumed guilty. In many areas of research, increasingly sentiment, not rigor, drives research. In debate, people who challenge prevailing orthodoxy are no-platformed, and various institutions are labeled safe spaces where people are protected from challenging ideas. So in these two ways, our society increasingly seems to lack perspective. We do not recognize that no reasonable discussion can be had without an appreciation of context, and many fail to see that they themselves are speaking and thinking from within a context. But the key question in this but the key question is this to do with a particular generation and how it is being raised? I'd argue that while these trends may be more prevalent among younger generations, this is less to do with how they've been raised per se, and more a consequence of changes in our communications technology. The advent of social media is, I would argue, a more seismic change to our communications technology than TV, radio, or even the printing press. I go so far as to say it is the most consequential development in communications technology since the invention of writing. The effect of social media is really twofold. First, the algorithm drives us not to encounter views that disagree with or temper our own, but towards those who share the same views. This has widened our tribal divisions. Second, the nature of social media is that when we post our thoughts online, we are always doing so from a digital stage in front of an audience, which can be a single person to potentially hundreds of millions. It is as such an inherently performative space. It's a place for signaling our virtues and declaiming our identities. As such, social media is a technology that deepens and hardens tribalism and the lack of perspective this brings, not one that allows us to transcend it and helps us see things more clearly. And it is certainly arguable, in my view, that it is either an extraordinary coincidence that the climate movement, social justice movements, lockdown fundamentalism, and the lack of perspective on the Trump phenomenon from both his opponents and his proponents have all occurred at precisely the time when the new technology of social media has saturated society and the public sphere, or there is a causal connection between this infrastructural development and the polarization we're seeing across society. Young people are more online than older ones, but this arguably has two countervailing effects. On the one hand, yes, the younger generation are a greater proportion of the online community that is subject to the growing tribalism and its attendant narrowing of perspective. However, as digital natives, they are also more streetwise about the pitfalls of social media than those who come to it later in life. Few would disagree that a pensioner with Facebook is more likely to fall for fake news than someone in their 20s. I will end with an analogy. While we should be cautious about using the term the Dark Ages, it is arguable, nevertheless, that the invention of the printing press in 1450 allowed an underexposed picture of the world to become better exposed. It led to the Reformations, which laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, whose values, which have underpinned the modern era, are precisely those that are at risk in our society as it now loses perspective. If the printing press allows an underexposed picture of reality to become better exposed, the online world is now taking, I think, a reasonably well-exposed picture and rendering it overexposed. And as any photographer knows, under and overexposure amount really to the same thing, an unclear picture of what we're looking at. The issue today is not that we lack information, but that we are so overwhelmed by information that we have no way to sort the wheat from the chaff. We have no way to gain perspective. If the invention of the printing press began the modern era by leading directly to the Reformations, I think we can plausibly argue that the invention of the internet is leading 500 years later, almost exactly, to what we might call the deformations. This is an age characterized by a loss of perspective and dispassion. But this is not due to something as simple as a changing of the generational guard, in my view, but more to do with the deforming effect of social media on how we narrate and indeed how we relate to each other. The consequences of this, I think, are far deeper, lasting, and profound than a culture clash between generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholson. Now it is time to present our panelists, and we have to start. Allow me to start with the ladies. So, Mary Lucia Darst is a candidate doctor of philosophy and music at the University of Oxford. She holds a master's in history and literature from Columbia University. She's a writer, she's a researcher, a filmmaker, and an active classical musician. Mrs. Darst, welcome, and greetings from Greece, and just a few words from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgios. Speaking as a member of the second to youngest generation, yes, I absolutely categorically state that we have no perspective. That is my stance. Excuse me, I have my flatmate in the house. And I will elaborate a little, but the two main problems I see with the younger generation, my generation, and Generation Z is there's a lack of long-term thinking. There's a lack of long-term ability to plan. And in this, I don't mean, for example, the environmental movement and the interest in sustainability indicate that there is a knowledge that this is necessary, but in terms of ability to think for oneself, ability to plan one's life, that is simply not there. And then this ties to Dr. Nicholson's assessment of context. There's also a lack of curiosity. There's a lack of willingness to become informed. And there's a blanket expectation that the world should matches, or at least should match, is morally obligated to match an individual's point of view or limitations. So that's my sense.
Thank you very much. Our second panelist is Dr. Charalambakis. He has been teaching economics and finance in the United States for the past two decades. Currently, he teaches economics at the University of Kentucky. He's an author, he's a notable speaker, and he's also the chief economist for the Blacksummit Financial Group. Dr. Charalambakis, welcome. Καλώς ήρθατε. Good to have you here. Your introductional statement as well.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this significant event. If I could just say a few words on this very important topic, is that my fear is countries throughout Europe, as well as in North America, we're losing what true pedia is. And when a country loses what true pedia is, then it loses its ability to think. When a country loses its ability to think, it loses its ability to judge things. Therefore, it loses the ability to discover truth. And after that, they construct their own truth. God created us in his image, and we decided to create a God in our image because we lost true pedia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Nicholson, he's a writer, he's an academic. He has a background in social anthropology and human geography. He teaches courses on international development, international migration, and the politics of climate change. And he's the UK correspondent for the Economic Standard. Dr. Nicholson, welcome once again. Greetings from Greece. Your statement as well.
Thanks. Well, obviously, I mean, I've just had a fairly long statement, so I won't take up too much time. But I mean, essentially, to boil down my point is simply that I think every generation likes to think the new generation are a bunch of idiots and lack perspective. And we all tend to do this. And I think that, and often, though, we forget that when we think that, the person to blame is not actually the kids, it's the people who brought them up. So often the generation criticizing don't realize they're really criticizing themselves because they're saying, well, actually, we brought them up badly. That's essentially what's implied. And I do feel that culture changes. We tend to draw value judgments on changing culture if it's not what we're familiar with. So, you know, I grew up in the pre-social media age. And I find, you know, I now really struggle with new. I don't understand TikTok or Instagram or any of these things, and I'm only in my mid-30s. So, you know, for me, I draw a value judgment. I think, well, who'd waste their time on that stuff? But I think that generation, for them, they're native to it, and so every generation passes value judgments on the next generation's ideas. But that doesn't mean there's anything intrinsically wrong. The culture is just different. It's just not my culture, in a sense. It doesn't mean it's bad. That said, I do think there are some worrying trends across the culture, but I do see it as being not just among the generation. Something I have noticed, and I used to work for a politician, and it was very interesting reading the emails coming in, the most from constituents. The most angry emails we got were actually from people who are 68 to 76, sort of the first cohort baby boomers. The people older than that were incredibly polite. The people younger than that were reasonably polite. But that particular generation were extremely angry, and they seem to be the generation who were young enough to have access to social media and computing, because they weren't yet in their 80s. And so they were IT literate, but they weren't really street smart. And so often they'd been taken in by all the fake news, and they'd write to their MP angrily about whatever they'd read. And I don't think that's because, so that almost the psychology of the generation, speaking generally, seem to have shifted. And I think that's an effect, again, of social media. So I think it's very easy for us to point fingers at different generations, but ultimately, we need to look to the structural factors. And when I say structural, I almost mean the infrastructural factors. And I think that we're naive if we don't see how profound a shift social media is, not just in the information we consume, but frankly, how we relate to one another, particularly during the pandemic, where the only way we've been able to relate to one another is as we're doing this now via these virtual networks where, it's very hard to maintain empathy if you can't see the audience. I've just been talking probably too long. Half the audience may be bored with what I'm saying right now. I can't see it in their face because I can't see them. So, and that's a problem with these types of communication technologies. However, I will assume I should stop now, so I will stop. But that's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now it is the time for the panel discussion. So based on what we heard from Dr. Nicholson, the microphone is yours to begin and to make any remarks or set your point regarding anything. Dr. Charalambakis, I see you have your mic on. That's why. Should we start with you? Yeah.
Sure. Several times when an issue is raised, we may ask what is behind the question that we are being asked. If we care about the future generation, not just this one, but the generations that will come 30 years and maybe 100 years from now, should the question maybe be rephrased in the sense of, how do we grow up a generation that will have good judgment, will make good judgment calls? What are those criteria, those ingredients that make the generation to truly draft a new chapter in history in terms of good judgment calls? How it selects its politicians, how it drafts legislation, how it executes justice, what the priorities are. I believe that if we run an institution, the first and foremost, most critical decision we are going to make is who is the CEO, right? If we are board members in an institution, either for-profit or non-for-profit institution, the most vital role of a board member is to hire the CEO. That's the ultimate judgment. It's not to decide about the budget. Budgets are important, but eventually the entity is run by the CEO. So what criteria the board uses in order to select the CEO? In a similar manner at the society at large, what are those ingredients that will make the future generation to have good judgment? And in my humble opinion is, yes, social media is great. Politics, yeah, we can change even our minds in politics. But if we lose the way that we bring up the younger generation in terms of the pedia, the education we give them, then we're going to lose that generation. We have already lost, speaking in Greece, we have already lost almost 2 generations, either because of the financial crisis or the brain drain that has taken place. And do we truly educate the kids, the new generation, I'm sorry for using the term the kids, do we truly educate our younger generation in classical pedia, in classical education, so they will be able to integrate their thinking, whether their thinking is in terms of psychology, politics, religion, economics, sociology? Are they able to integrate that? Without that ability to integrate, they are not going to have a good judgment. And they're going to lose the truth. They're going to discover, they're going to construct their own truth. And then we're all condemned to lies.
True. can I ask you something related to what you said about the steps ahead in terms of pedia? You talked about seeing forward in 40, 50, or 100 years ahead. If we consider the fact that we've been living online for the past 40 years and the social media have taken over for the past 15 years, how easy is to plan ahead? And I'm setting the question to everyone. How easy is to plan ahead 20 or 30 years from now when things are growing up and expanding in such a manner?
That's a difficult question. Societies change. Technology changes. And money talks. My fear, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, sorry.
My fear is that we don't have the visionaries who will be able to help us understand what the future holds. And visionaries do not exist without true education. Again, I will go back to what I believe is the true cause. We train people. We no longer educate people. Thank you.
I completely agree with everything you just said, actually. I mean, I think there's a couple of things you said that were absolutely on the money, which is that where we're looking at this notion of lacking perspective, the core thing, the real question we need to ask is, well, what really constitutes perspective? What is it to have perspective? And I think what you were implying, which I think is absolutely the case in my view, is that it's about judgment. It's not really about knowledge. It's about having the ability to discern between things, to make judgment calls, to prioritize, essentially. And that really is, again, comes back to what I was saying about context. And you mentioned about, we teach kids now, we train them rather than educate them. Well, what is education? Again, education, I think, is about not tactical training, but strategic vision. It's about integrating things together into the whole. And there's a very interesting British writer who was a former psychiatrist or psychologist, perhaps, called Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a book in 2009 called The Master and His Emissary. And he makes an argument that's very relevant to, I think, the framing you're putting on it, which I'd agree with, which is that he says we have the left and the right brain. And he says, we've never really known, there's been debates in science as to what is the role of the left and the right brain. Some people say it's the female and the male brain and the scientific and the artistic brain and so on. And he rejects all that. He says, that's all wrong. He says, basically what it is that the left brain is essentially the bit of the brain that in animals is good at zooming in on details and getting food, essentially. The right brain is essentially about pulling back, zooming out, and being aware of who's going to eat you. And basically, these two sides of the brain, he says, in a healthy society, you have a balance where you have both sides are necessary, the side that zooms in on content and the side that pulls back and puts things in context. But he says, if you look throughout human history at every society that has collapsed, essentially what's happened is that the right brain is increasingly be devalued, where we think actually all we need is tactical knowledge and training. And we think we don't need to learn philosophy. We don't need to consider values. We've got science. And you've heard this a lot through the pandemic. Everyone keeps saying we need to be science-led, but actually values matter. And we are, society is, there is more to life, for instance, than the avoidance of death. There is more to society and to life than simply the length of life. There's also the quality of life. But all these things that can't be captured in a formal bit of knowledge that is absolute and categorical and objective is often now rejected as irrelevant. So you see in the universities, all this funding is going into STEM subjects, and everyone thinks, well, philosophy is just an indulgent thing. It's not very relevant. It's, in my view, far more fundamental, because it's all about training people to weigh options, to make judgment calls, to have good judgment. And I think this is really fundamentally when we talk about how do we improve education or how to improve society going forward, many people think we need political devolutions, have more political power to the people. Some people think we need more knowledge revolutions, better technology. But I think actually what we need is educational evolutions. We need to evolve our educational system out of this very sort of training regime, as you mentioned, and get it to more of a knowledge way of looking at it, a more not even knowledge, but a more wisdom in a sense, and to get away purely from training, to educate people to be aware of context, to be aware of the role of values in human life, and so yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying.
I agree completely that the root of the problem is in the education system and the fact that we train people as opposed to educate them. And the educational evolution might be the solution. Honestly, I think we could also look to history, and perhaps what we need is an educational devolution, an educational regression, where we draw a distinction between, we accept that there is a distinction between training people and educating people, and that maybe they don't need to be on the same tracks in life. Speaking as a millennial and being acutely aware of the problem, at least in the US, of millennial employment, there's an assumption that if you go through X amount of formal education, and then there will be a job waiting for you at the end of it. Obviously, this doesn't actually work. Many people don't have skill sets that are useful or desirable in the market. And I think that this is a huge part of the current generational lack of perspective, but I will also point out that it's not that unusual. I know anecdotally that there are baby boomers, Gen Xers, even going back to pre-World War II. There was a fundamental assumption of formal education equals nice job at the end of the line. We have reached the point where that model, which I am fairly certain never truly existed anyway, most certainly does not exist. And speaking as someone who attended Columbia and therefore was obligated to be available to answer questions to prospective applicants, sadly, one of the many things that I faced was people who would contact me wanting to know about applying to Columbia, and their main interest was they were looking for a meal ticket or looking for that magical portal that would lead to security and a high income and things like that. And of course, that's not what a true education does. So I think we need to reform our ideas, certainly.
So in terms of this educational evolution, since we're talking about a plethora of educational systems across the world, is it something that should we expect from a specific educational system or from an overall, a global, let's say, reaction to that?
If I could just, sorry to...
No, that was my question.
I think that there's something we need to consider quite strongly, which is that when we discuss these issues, it's often easy to discuss them in the abstract without reference to political context. And I love to go on about context, as you may have noticed. But I do think it's important for us to draw a distinction between liberal democratic contexts, where a core organizing tenet is the freedom, well, they say freedom of speech, but what is freedom of speech? It's really the freedom to dissent from power. It's the freedom to criticize power. And I think that the notion of an educational system which has civic value like that, of training people of how to be citizens who not only can, do well at their job, their STEM job, but also actually be judicious, well-judged members of the community who can look at what someone is saying to them and actually make a good judgment call as to whether it should be listened to or not. This is a very liberal democratic, the liberal democratic context is crucial to that. So when we say, is it a specific educational system or global, I think maybe neither. It's not so much, I mean, within the West, we have many forms of educational systems. We have private universities, public universities, and so on. But I think what we're talking about is less the letter of the institution, more the spirit of the culture. And the one thing that I think has been lost in the West is that the spirit of the culture seems to have etiolated it. It's fallen away. And I feel now we're a culture that is all letter, not spirit. People always say, don't just listen to the letter of what I said, listen to the spirit of it. And if you see what's happening now, in social media and in the public debate at the moment, particularly in the Anglosphere, you just see constantly from left and right of this political spectrum, people arguing in bad faith where they're not really engaging with the spirit of what someone said. I mean, the tendency for people to ignore intent, and it absolutely applies on both sides of all these issues. The presumption of guilt and the presumption of bad intent in people, it seems very inhumane and unsympathetic. So in my view, it's really a case of, the level of where we need an educational evolution is really changing changing the spirit of the culture around education, what we think it's trying to achieve. Thank you.
George, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
George, let me give you an example from an everyday life. Let's say, I don't know if you have kids, but let's say you had a 10-year-old boy or girl.
A 12-year-old. Let's make it real. Yes.
Okay,
He's
let's
12.
get real. Okay. A boy or a girl?
A boy.
God forbid, the boy needed a heart surgery. Would you trust me to operate on your son?
If you were a heart surgeon, yes.
How do you know if I'm a competent heart surgeon?
Okay, that might seem like a hard question, but nowadays it's more easy to answer to something like that because it's not just the word of mouth. It's not just the online reputation, let's say. Yep. It's a series of factors that indicate whether you are a good heart surgeon.
Absolutely. So you will do your due diligence to find out if I'm a good heart surgeon.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden you discover that I'm an economist. Would you trust me to operate on your son?
As an economist, no. I'm afraid not.
Thank you. How do we trust the minds of the younger generation to incompetent teachers? That's the key. We have incompetent teachers who don't know how to teach, who don't know how to communicate the critical messages of pedia, and therefore we destroy our societies. We have a bunch of incompetent teachers.
Can I make an intervention there? The issue is, though, I think with a lot, I mean, I agree that I think that the quality of teaching is bad, but the question again is why? And I think the core question in this discussion, where we're talking about, are we raising a generation that lacks perspective, is the core question is the problem to do with the generation, a particular failing in them or how they've been brought up, or is it something more systemic in the culture? And I think that my view would be that, yes, if teaching is poor, well, ultimately, we need to have a discussion. What are we trying to teach? And I think it's more that the problem is more that as a society, we no longer really know what the purpose of education is. And it's one of those problems that, the writer Oswald Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West. 100 years ago, it was published. And he said that every culture is kind of like an organism, and eventually it fossilizes into a civilization. And he says you see this in cultures where they start to, instead of having norms and traditions, they start to have formal laws for everything. Everything is very regulated, and instead of just being a bit more organic and a bit more based on trust and relationships, it's very prescriptive. And we can feel it now in the culture that, well, one of the major problems I think teachers run into is teachers used to be trusted to actually, you put the kids in their charge and they're trusted to be competent and to get on with it. But now, of course, there is so much fear that they're not being efficient enough, that they're constantly being regulated, they're constantly being audited. I used to be the governor of a school, and we rarely, if ever, spent time talking about what's happening in the classroom. It was all about looking at the forms, assessing the classroom performance in a quantitative manner. And that was all towards the goal of improving the quality of teaching. But all it really did was siphon off everyone's time to deal with bureaucracy. And it meant that people were no longer trying to teach the child, the actual person, but more to tick all the right boxes on the formal representation of the child. And I think that, so when we look at, incompetent teachers, we've really got to ask, well, what is the cultural situation that has led to this situation where teachers can no longer teach? I simply don't buy the idea that they're just bad teachers. I think there's something about the culture that is incentivizing them in the wrong direction. And
I'm not only arguing that we have incompetent teachers who don't know how to teach. The whole system sucks. We don't have the true priorities. We don't have the right attitude about education. We have eventually create a bureaucracy that cannot allow teachers to teach, because not all of them could be incompetent. Eventually, they may have been forced to a job that they don't want to do. But unless the society starts changing its educational system, we'll keep producing leaders who are incompetent. I'm sure each one of us has a memory of a very good teacher. 3 weeks ago, I gathered some of my classmates in high school, and we met with our favorite teacher 3 weeks ago, a physics professor, physics teacher in high school. It was a great moment to have him around. We all remember how he taught us and how he cared for us. That's what a true teacher does. He cares. He or she cares to eventually develop our minds, how to think.
So something went wrong in between, you might say. I mean, between your good physics teacher and today's physics teacher, and today's physics teacher, something went wrong. So how further back we have to look in terms of education, in terms of politics, because Dr. Nicholson mentioned Trump, but Trump is something that took place during the last 4 or 5 years. But the circumstances that brought Trump into the main political scene did not occur like 5 years ago. It's something that has its roots way back. So how way back should we have to go and trace the root of this?
My view is that the neoliberal period, as people sometimes call it, the last 40 years, I think has a very particular characteristic that sets it apart from all the other eras, is that for me, the way I phrase it is that the technology of neoliberal economics is computing, and the economics of computing is neoliberalism, because you could not have this neoliberal world without the data. Even in the 1980s, without the Excel spreadsheets and all the information, the number crunching, and the ability, the information intensity of the last 40 years. And I don't think the critique to say neoliberalism's problem is to critique free market ideas. I think it's to critique the particular efficiency of that system to be like a hot knife cutting through the butter of the culture. Not a great analogy, but it's a very exacting form of economic system, and not the principles per se, but the actual practices driven by computing. And because that level, that sort of efficiency, which then was taught in the Harvard business schools of the world, I mean, the very notion of an MBA has exploded the last 30, 40 years, because suddenly people realized there was an entire job description in being a consultant to get this MBA and have very particular techniques that were very data-driven to go in and just improve the efficiency, but always towards a single goal, which was profit over people. And And in the past, I mean, we often forget what are markets. Markets are actually just relationships. We are always, right now we are exchanging words. We're having a free exchange of words. If you have items, you have things, we have a free exchange of things we're selling. That's all markets are. They're actually, it's a fancy word. When we talk about free markets, it's a fancy word for relationships. That's all it is. And I think we often forget this, that there's nothing wrong with relationships. And we should absolutely have, this is the free market roadshow. I think the freedom to exchange as best suits us, as long as we're not actually hurting anyone, is, I think, a crucial value, in as much as freedom of speech is crucial, as long as we're not hurting anyone, essentially. And I don't mean hurting people's feelings, I mean actually hurting someone. And my feeling is that what's changed between his physics teacher and the physics teachers today is simply that this system of constant audit, this notion that everything that is valued can be priced, that I remember when I was at university, this audit culture was starting to come in the UK, where we would get a form at the end of the course to assess the lecturer. And I remember thinking, this seems very rude. Why am I assessing the lecturer? And I was speaking to an old school academic, and he said, I was complaining about this. I said, it feels very arrogant of me to assess the lecturer. And he goes, you know what? He says, I always know when there's a good lecturer. I can stand outside the room and I can feel the buzz. And what he meant by that is that he'd had 40 years experience. He knew things intuitively that he could not prove quantitatively. He just knew it because he was experienced. And what we've done in this culture of computing is that we've lost any trust in experience. One last example before I'll be quiet, is that recently I had a back injury. And I went to see a doctor who was he's a physiotherapist for neurology. It was like a sciatica nerve injury. And, but I wasn't sure, because it's very hard to tell what back injury, what's causing it around discs. And he said, look, I can't prove it to you, but I've been doing this 40 years and my intuition tells me it's sciatica. And he said, I can't prove that to you, but that's just, I can't explain why I know that, but I know that. And I said, it's interesting. He said, well, the problem is, he said, the last 20 years, the medical system does not trust you as a doctor just to say, just trust me. This is what it is. I've been doing this 40 years. I can see the pattern. I can't explain it to you, but if you have my 40 years experience, I know. All of our institutions, from teaching to medicine, across the board, have lost the thing that was central to human life and society for centuries and millennia, which is the trust in not even expertise, but experience. That's the thing that we've lost in the culture.
Dr. Charalambakis, if you don't have anything to add, do you have anything to add to that? Because we have a question. Yes.
Yeah, please. Just maybe the final thought. There is a question from the audience. If education...
yes, I was about to ask you, all of you. Yeah, is education...
If it starts in school or in universities or in other places, I think education starts at home. I have 4 kids, now all of them are adults. From the very young age, I know at that point, probably they hated me. I had them start reading and writing drafts, summaries of biographies. Now, all of them, all the 4 of them are thankful nowadays because they can learn from those biographies. So education starts at home. And that's where we instill values. What is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust. That's what we do at home. Because if we want to, even speaking in economic terms, to have a viable middle class that can sustain a democracy, and let's not forget, you cannot have democracy unless you have a middle class. Middle class is a prerequisite to have a democracy. Let's look in the Middle East. They lack a middle class, they have no democracy. So if we would like to create and sustain a middle class, then we need to educate our youngsters. That's how we can sustain a middle class that loves the country, has the right priorities, and can advance democracy. Education starts at home.
Very right. Very right. You're absolutely right, and it's where the path begins. That the process does not start in kindergarten or in elementary school or whatever. It starts at home since day one. I don't know if you have something to add, Dr. Nicholson or Mrs. Darst. Okay. Yeah.
Just one final thought is just linking together something that's been discussed here, which is that the underlying theme, I think, that connects everything we've been talking about is the importance of relationships. When my colleague there talked about the need for teachers, the fundamental thing about teaching is care and care for the students, and then saying education begins at home. The common denominator there is not the narrations we teach, really. It's the relations that contextualize the teaching. And again, relations are always the context of, language is a public phenomenon. We teach through language, but language is a public phenomenon, meaning it's contextualized by relationships. And I think the big error or the big failing in our culture now is we no longer value relationships. We think people now, the other day I was in a cafe and these 4 lads came in and you could tell they hadn't seen each other all through lockdown. They were excited to see each other. They walk into the Starbucks and they give each other a hug. Oh, this is great. And they all sit down at the table together to catch up and they all go, and they all take out their phones and all 4 of them are on their phones. And it's, but it's funny, but that's the problem, is that we are literally losing we're losing the ability to be present with people, to actually talk to people. I struggle with it. We all do, I think. And we are all addicts to our technology. We have our lives filtered through technology and the internet. And additionally, I think the computing power has begun to make decisions around what is good for us and what is good for our students. And so therefore you end up having, like Ofsted here, the school regulatory body in the UK, which thinks that the way you make sure education improves is making sure the teacher spends 20 hours a week filling out forms saying the education's improved. But those are 20 hours that teacher has not spent with the students. And I know a few of those students in the school I taught, could have done with a little bit more FaceTime, a little bit more of that teacher actually being present, talking to them. That's the fundamental thing. And again, that begins at home. How often do you see parents with small children and the kid's tiring, so they give the kid an iPad to look after them, or the parents on the phone? It's disastrous. That's how societies collapse if we forget that we are a relational animal. Thank you.
See, this is a great way to use technology. The 4 guys in Starbucks, they used it to check their Facebook or their Instagram timeline. But during the last hour, we used it, I believe, for a good and great cause. And it was a very constructive conversation, to say the least. As we're approaching the end, I would like to hear all of you, your closing statement, a few words. I don't know. We should start with the ladies. So, Mrs. Darst, we hear you.
Yes, great debate. Yes, absolutely. The real problem, and I agree completely, lies in the home. Discussing how we are a relational creature, yes. And as a millennial, one problem I very much see is the fact that my generation has been taught, it's not an organic idea, that having relationships or networking is sleazy or slimy and signals that privilege. This is a huge problem, and on top of that, the behaviors that are necessary to have good relationships are now good table manners, for example, are now being branded as elitist and signs of privilege. It is completely irrational. And once again, I think this does go back to problems in the home. The rest of the world, society isn't meant to be your mother. Your mother should teach you good table manners, and if you don't have one who can't do that for you, I'm very sorry, but grow up and get over it.
Dr. Charalambakis, your words.
Yeah. Life is like a bus. Step number 1, get the wrong people off the bus. Step number 2, get the right people on the bus. Step number 3, then decide where the bus is going to go. Thank you.
Great. Dr. Nicholson, your final words.
My final words would just be, well, first of all, thank you to everyone for attending and for the opportunity to speak. You know, where we ask, are we raising a generation who lacks perspective? Fundamentally, I think the issue is, just to answer it, in my view, is that I think we have, as a culture, we're losing perspective. What that means is we're losing a sense of what that context matters. But another way of saying that is we've started to think that the only thing that matters is narrations, not relations, is what we think, not how we interact. And I think that you know, society is a network of individuals. What we say to each other is busy work. The important thing is to actually be saying something to each other. Thank you.
Well, all I have to say is thank you. Ευχαριστώ. It was great, and there's more to come. I would like to thank, of course, the Free Market Roadshow people, all of you who have joined us, and Barbara, you have the final word to say.
Well, thank you, Georgios. I think this was really a very, not only entertaining, but very straightforward debate. And there is, as you mentioned, more to come. I think this topic is so important for the next generation because we can't stand work-life balance, attitude and issues. And there is so many things that we need to do as not only as individuals, but also as entrepreneurs and as intellectuals, that we have to continue this conversation. In that way, I want to thank you as well for joining us, and stay tuned. The Free Market Roadshow is continuing. There is much more to come. There is many other cities that are still there. Plus, let me remind you of our playlist, not only via YouTube and our Facebook page, but also on our homepage, freemarketroadshow-rs.com. Feel free to join us. Looking forward to seeing you all there. And thanks again. Have a great evening. Thank you to all the speakers. You were wonderful and entertaining as always. And thank you for the great job of running the show, Georgios. Bye-bye. See you soon. Stay tuned.
See you soon.
Bye.